speak on another occasion, didn't he? That's correct. Okay, so the Honourable Rick Mazza.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as I make this last speech in this place, there's something that comes to mind very clearly, and that is that in this parliament, time goes by extremely fast. Of all of the occupations I've had over the years, I think a parliamentarian, with all the things we have to deal with, committee meetings, coming to this place, dealing with constituents, the years just go by so very, very quickly. So it hardly feels that I've actually been here for 8 years. Back in 2012, we formed the Shooters and Fishers Party in Perth, a branch of the Shooters and Fishers Party which had been established in New South Wales since 1995. We were registered with the Electoral Commission very late in 2012, I think it might have been around November, ran a campaign, and as fortune would have it, I got elected. So I got elected, winning a seat in the agricultural region. And there's quite a few members still here from the class of 2013 when I look around. And there's plenty that are going to continue to go on. Some will retire and some will go on to do other things in this place. But I came in here completely unprepared, experienced in any way, anything to do with politics. But fortunately, the fellowship and the assistance of all members of this place, regardless of their political leanings, was invaluable. And I found many people were always willing to help, whether that be the clerks, other members of Parliament, to give me a bit of a hand in getting myself organised to operate as a single member of my party. I remember the Honourable Barry House, the former President. I'd been here for about 6 months, and I met him in the corridors at the back, and he said to me, "Rick, when we first heard that a member of the Shooters and Fishers Party had been elected, we were expecting this gun-toting redneck to come in here. But," he said, "you're actually quite reasonable." And I did appreciate that, that he thought I was quite reasonable. But look, I've had a lot of occupations over the years too, which I think has helped me a lot as far as being able to relate to people, understand some of their problems out in the community. So over the years, I've been a spare parts assistant at a tractor dealership. I've been a motor mechanic. I've been a small business owner. I've been a cleaning chemical salesman in the hospitality industry, a real estate agent, a TAFE lecturer, an insurance broker, a settlement agent, a farmer, and it might surprise some that I actually spent some time as an guard delivering payrolls at the Collie Mines, and that was a very interesting couple of years. So what we do is we get the armed vehicle from the depot, which ironically is now my former business partner's real estate agency, operates out of there, and we drive to this bunker. You had to see it to believe it, in Bunbury, which is all underground, concrete lined. We load these containers full of cash into the back of this rickety old truck. We drive down the South West Highway, up the Coalfields Mine Road, into Collie to the ANZ Bank, where we'd unload the cash. And while we had a cup of coffee, the bank would then distill all the cash into the little brown envelopes, which many senior members here might remember before electronic funds transfer, that you all lined up and you got your little brown envelope with your name, your designation, how many hours you worked, your rate and everything on the front of it. So then we drive out along the Mumbalup Road into the mine access road, and there would be the lines of workers waiting for their pay. And we'd get out with all the jeers and the sneers as we got the cash into the paymaster, who would then unpack all of the containers, and then we'd go. Now, we did that on the same day, at the same time, every single week. And how we never got robbed is still a mystery to me today. There's obviously no serious crooks out there. All the colleague coal miners had warned everybody off touching their pay. For some reason, we had to go then every couple of months to the local Sporting Shooters Association pistol club for some practice. Now, with all respect to my two colleagues at the time, they were well in retirement years, so when they held their .38 special revolver out, it was all very shaky and they rarely ever hit the target. And I soon learnt that the one that was issued to me, I had to aim 1.5 metres to the left if I was going to hit the target. So I'm very pleased that no one ever took us to task, because the white flag and the hands up would have gone straight away, I reckon. Madam President, not long after I was here, on the advice of my very experienced electorate officer, Anne Ferguson Stewart, we thought we'd have an office opening that would showcase a little bit about who we were as far as the shooters and fishers were concerned. And many of you did attend that office opening. In fact, when we were cleaning out the office, I did find the menu that we had. And I had a little look at that menu, so I'll read some of the menu out. So we had wild harvest pork and venison bratwurst style sausage and panini with special mayonnaise and green tomato chutney, flash fried breast of quail and crisp bread, venison skewers, and the wines were of course Mazza wines from Dardanup if anybody wants any of those. But also from the Victoria's game hunting region we had ladies who shoot their lunch, which the Honourable Sue Ellery found quite amusing at the time, and Are You Game from Fowles Wines in Strathburn. And that was quite a good night. Unfortunately, the Honourable Barry House at that time had a delegation of MPs from Canada. Some of you might remember, I think it might have been Saskatchewan they were from, that were here at the time. And he put his apologies in. He said, look, I'm really sorry, Rick, we've been invited to Government House, and so we're going to have to go there. And I said, oh, priorities take their place, no trouble at all. So as the night started to wear down at about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, in rolls Big Barry with the whole delegation behind him. He said, mate, they heard all about it and they wanted to come, so here they are. So we had all the Canadian MPs there, we put the burners back on, we fired the whole thing back up again. And I'll never forget, there was a First Nations female MP there, and there's this big plate of yabbies that a Boyup Brook farmer had provided to us. And I don't know what discussions they had in the car, but she looked at me and she said, Rick, if this has been a redneck, then I'm a redneck. So that was a good opening. During my time here, I was fortunate to get a few inquiries started up. One of the first ones was a review of the Firearms Act. Some of you may remember there was a massive fee hike on applications, some 400%. And so I moved a disallowance motion here. And a couple of members of the government at the time actually crossed the floor, supported by the opposition. But unfortunately, the disallowance motion didn't succeed. But what it did do is it instigated an inquiry by the Joint Audit Committee at the time, who looked into it and found that there were some anomalies in their report. The Attorney-General at the time then asked the Law Reform Commission to do a review over 2 years. Now, that Law Reform Commission did a very forensic review of the Firearms Act. They had a lot of evidence. They travelled to other states and they looked at it very impassioned. They had a lot of witnesses that they had interviewed, including WA Police. That review had 143 recommendations in it. And unlike a lot of these reviews, both the firearms community and WAPOL were actually quite comfortable with most of it. And so we looked at implementing those. The former Police Minister, the Honourable Michelle Roberts, formed a ministerial working group for firearms reform. And we worked for about 18 months. I think it was Ron Bryant from the Sporting Shooters Association, Bevan Steele from the Firearm Traders Association, myself and WAPOL. And WAPOL had broken those recommendations up into 3 tranches. Obviously the easier ones, the low-hanging fruit, was in the first tranche, and we'd agreed upon that. And we put that up to the Minister. Now, for some reason it never got to the Parliament or this place, for some reason. I asked questions about it, but it hasn't got there. Now, I do recall in the Governor-General's speech and the manifesto of things that this government wants to achieve in this term, that there was firearms reform, firearms legislation reform. So I'm hopeful that the Minister, the new Minister, Paul Papalia, will reinstate that ministerial working group, look at the Law Reform Commission rather than reinvent the wheel, and put forward some amendments consistent with that Law Reform Commission report, because it was a very good report. The next inquiry that I managed to convince this House to set up was a recreational hunting system inquiry, which was undertaken by the Public Administration Committee, to which I was co-opted. The Honourable Jackie Boydell was on that, and the Honourable Darren West was also on that inquiry. And we had witnesses, everything ranging from the Wildflower Society to the Commissioner of Police. It was a really interesting inquiry, in fact. And it did entail some travel. So a few of us travelled to New South Wales to start with, and we looked at the recreational hunting system they had in that state, which had only been implemented about 15 years earlier. And they had a very sophisticated system. So they had very good technology. You had to go online with a booking system to be able to book a forest block. That was obviously limited to how many people could go there. There was apps on phones, and they were able to, through GPS mapping, switch out forest blocks if there was other activities there, like a mountain bike competition or a forest coop that had to be harvested or whatever the case was. They suspended that recreational hunting system in there for about 12 or 18 months. They moved from the Game Council, which had a few issues, into a game unit, which was under the Department of Primary Industries. What was interesting when we were there, there's two things that the game unit had explained to us. One was that they found that the amount of illegal activity in the forest had reduced because there's more eyes in the bush and there's more reporting back to them about issues that shouldn't be there. Maybe some cropping going on or whatever the case was. So that was interesting. The other thing is that while they had the suspension, there was a lot of complaints from country New South Wales because they were getting a lot of revenue and it was helping their economy where people were going there, buying accommodation, supplies and that type of thing, which really helped those rural communities. So those rural communities were very happy when the system was reinstated. It also had a big impact on the amount of expenditure that the state government had to undertake as far as pest animal control was concerned. We then went down to Victoria, where recreational hunting systems have been in place for probably 60 or 70 years. I think the Honourable Steve Dawson might have been involved in that at one stage or worked in the department. And they also have a very good system. And what was of interest there is that recreational hunters take something like 157,000 feral deer a year out of that forest system, which if they were let to breed up would be a real impact on the forest. And also, it's about a 10-year study, but they found there's about $439 million of value to the Victorian community, or the Victorian economy in recreational hunting. One of the highlights, though, is that we visited an area called the Hart Morass. I did watch a program recently about the Hart Morass, but it was really something to see. And what we did learn is that a morass is actually a wetland that is lower than the bordering river water table level. But that Hart Morass area near Sale in Gippsland had been deteriorated and overgrazed for many, many years, and it was a mess. We've seen all of the old photos of how bad the condition of it was. So the Field and Game Association in that state in 2007 bought one parcel of land in the Hart Morass through funds that were granted to them by the Williamson Foundation. And they set about rehabilitating the land. Obviously what they were looking to do was improve habitat for their lifestyle of duck hunting at certain times of the year. Later on they bought another two parcels, the total costing them about $2.4 million and now encompass 3,200 acres. And it's a really good example of conservation, practical conservation in practice. Not tying yourself to a bulldozer, but actually doing something. And they planted 60,000 trees. They've worked with their catchment council in that state and they've worked out when to drain areas, when not to drain areas. There's a lot of acid sulfates in the water there, so you've got to be very careful when you drain areas. They've replanted a lot of grasslands, and if you've seen it now, it's absolutely pristine. And the comments made by my colleagues on that trip was they couldn't believe there wasn't one empty beer can, there wasn't one piece of paper. It was absolutely and totally pristine and had been rehabilitated to a fantastic level. Now that area now, obviously their duck shooting season, there's only a few weeks a year, so when they're not using it, all members of Field and Game pay $70 for a key. That gives them 12 months access. They can go and use it for camping, family picnics, whatever they like. School kid tours go there. The kids get to learn all about environment and what they can do to actually help the environment. There's the Bird Observation Society that goes and identifies birds. They all work together with them. They put up nesting boxes. And even the local community at Sale get to use it as a walking trail in the off-season. So it's a really good example of hunting and conservation together. So that was a good inquiry, which I enjoyed. There's some recommendations in the report that haven't been implemented, but there has been some alternatives which I think are a good start. The next inquiry was quite a controversial one. It was the RSPCA Select Committee. And what I found out is that select committee had been, for some reason, the first select committee established in about 7 years, and yet in the 40th Parliament we had select committees every week. But we only had this first one, the first in about 6 or 7 years. It was controversial, and I must admit at times it got a little bit uncomfortable. There was debates in another place where we were accused of being a committee of assassins, and it was a witch hunt, and the RSPCA certainly took umbrage for us looking into their operations. But I'm glad that we did undertake that inquiry, because quite a few things came out of it. And ironically, there's other states of Australia that were at the same time undertaking similar inquiries, and particularly in the UK, the birthplace of the RSPCA, there were similar inquiries being undertaken there as well. And without going through the full report, one of the things that stood out the most was the fact that the RSPCA, as a private charity, does not have any legislative power at all to investigate or prosecute. Zero. And a lot of people don't understand how the connection is that you have RSPCA officers that can do that. What it is under the Animal Welfare Act, the CEO of the Department of Agriculture and Food appoints general inspectors. And so they've appointed not only RSPCA employees, which is also required under the Animal Welfare Act, but in the past they've also appointed council rangers, Department of Environment rangers, or I think even in a couple of cases they had appointed people who had operated animal shelters, which I don't think was a very wise move. Part of the problem is those appointments, which last for 5 years, that were unconditional. There's no conditions on them. And unfortunately, there was a lot of tension between the RSPCA as a society and the Department of Agriculture and Food, and to the point where they resented each other a lot. What I think should have been a better outcome for all of that, because what the general inspectors were doing was taking all of their direction from the RSPCA, not from the department. And Justice Corby, in one of his findings, had said, really, the general inspectors are an agent of the Department of Agriculture and Food. And it follows for me that an agent should always refer to their principal for direction, or reporting, very little reporting as well. And these very same issues were being investigated in the UK. And one MP in the UK said that the functions of campaigner, fundraiser, investigator, prosecutor should have oceans of blue water between them instead of Chinese walls. And in fact, what should happen is that, like Scotland and Ireland, they can investigate, but then provide a brief to the state. And it should be the state, in their own impassioned assessment, look at whether charges or prosecution should be commenced. And I know the Minister's looking at a review of the Animal Welfare Act, and I think that's a very important part. And then, of course, we had the private property rights inquiry, quite a recent one, report number 33 by the Public Administration Committee, which I wasn't co-opted onto, but I did attend some of the hearings as an observer. And I think it was a really useful report. It was very accurate. I commend the committee members on the level of investigation they had and being able to capture the issues that affect the community out there as far as private property rights are concerned. And this is really affecting the community directly. It's not sort of some airy-fairy thing that you might do to improve it. It's actually affecting lives, particularly things like environmentally sensitive areas or conditions on titles. So I think it's very, very important that that report at some stage be referred to. I know we had an inquiry into private property rights in 2005. I think the Honourable Sue Ellery was on that particular committee. Going back a while, I don't know that much came out of that. That was a very good report too. But this report 33, I really do encourage the government to have a good look at that and make some changes where people's lives aren't so badly affected. The Honourable Ken Baston, in his contribution last week, spoke about the wild dog bounty while he was Minister that he had implemented. And I had many discussions with the Minister at that time about this bounty, because they're used extensively in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland as a means of reducing wild dogs and even foxes in those states. For some reason, the department here has a lot of resistance to it. Questions that I asked in this place had revealed that there had been over 520 dogs taken within a very short period of time, and it only cost the state about $52,000, which is really good value for money. But for some reason there seems to be a resistance to that. I know in Victoria, foxes and wild dogs, they have bounty systems. Sometimes there's a bit of political pressure to back off, but they reinstate them again because they find that the numbers are starting to climb. So in the overall management of wild dogs and foxes, I know we've got exclusion fencing, which is very important, and we also have doggers, which is also very important, but I think we shouldn't underestimate ground shooting and using bounties as a way to also reduce those wild dog numbers, because not just pastoralists that are affected by this. You can imagine the devastation on wildlife in the pastoral regions by wild dogs. Some of the pastoralists I've spoken to said there used to be lots of goats here, there's not anymore, including kangaroos and marsupials and everything else. They're gone, the wild dogs have eaten them all. So, you know, I think it's something that should be revisited, and I congratulate the Honourable Ken Baston for having the courage at the time to actually do something about that, but unfortunately it didn't continue. Madam President, I'd just like to touch on the fact that you, as the first female president of this place, showed a lot of courage in protecting the conventions, the privileges and the institution of the Legislative Council. I listened to the condolence motions of the Honourable Clive Griffiths, and from all the speakers there was like a common thread, and that was that the protection of the conventions and the privileges of the upper house were paramount. He served under both Liberal and Labor governments, and that was what he had pushed forward, that the protection of the Legislative Council is paramount. Madam President, you took your solemn duty seriously, and you have protected as best you can the privileges of this parliament. And we'll wait to see how things turn out with that. And I certainly encourage the new president, whoever that might be, to also look at the fact that this is not about party politics, this is about the institution of the Legislative Council, and the fact that, you know, the democracy relies on all the pillars of democracy, including privilege, and to erode any of that, I think, is a slippery slope. And there's been a lot of, if you look sort of back through the centuries in forging the democratic system, there's been a lot of blood spilt and a lot of lives lost to establish a democratic system. Madam President, depending on electoral reform, I look forward to the shooters, fishers and farmers in 2025 contesting the next election. And I raise that because I was listening to some talkback radio on the South Coast a few weeks back where the Attorney-General had flagged that there would be a review of the Legislative Council electoral system. And there was a lot of talk about one vote, one value, and the fact that the mining pastoral region in particular had a weighting of about six and a half times that someone in the city. And I have great concerns about that. In fact, I heard the Honourable Darren West reply on it. But I have some concerns on that, Madam President. The Australian Federal Senate has 12 senators per state. If we had one vote, one value in Australia for the Senate, then Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland would have far more senators than we do. And I don't think Western Australia wants to see a reduction in the amount of representation that we have in the Federal Senate. Western Australia is definitely the powerhouse of the economy for the entire country, and therefore we need to have those 12 senators represent us. And when you look at the mining, pastoral and the agricultural regions, sure, we don't have the population, but I would say they are also the powerhouses of the state economy. And there's many challenges out in those regions that city people just don't have when it comes to essential services, just getting around the place, it's so huge. So to reduce the representation in those regions, I think, would be a travesty. Now, look, there could be some reform that's required. What shape that takes, I don't know. You know, whether you adopt a Senate-type system or a New South Wales-type system where you have the whole state, whatever. But I think one vote, one value is fraught with a lot of problems. And I wouldn't like to see that in place. So depending on we'll go into caretaker mode, but depending on how that electoral reform works out will depend where we are. But hopefully we'll be back to have another go. Madam President, as I come to the end of this speech, I'd just like to thank a few people, and first and foremost would have to be my wife Brenda, who's been by my side the entire time, always encouraged me, When licking wounds, she'd always give me a pat on the back and a red wine just to calm me down. But she's always been there supporting us all the way through, and I'm very grateful for that. And also my family, Madam President, my parents, my children, my grandchildren, and my soon-to-be great-grandchild in November, have always been very supportive of me right through. My electorate staff, Anne Ferguson-Stewart, who has been there from the beginning, a very experienced electorate officer. She's worked for ministerial departments, both federally and state, and she's certainly helped me to get up and running, and I am eternally grateful to her. Lucy Redskowski, who has been with who's been with us for this term of Parliament. Now, Lucy is a brilliant research officer. She actually reads legislation Hansard for fun. If I ever need anything, I had it in a hot second, and her intellectual capacity is just, beyond reproach. So I do thank her very much for her services, and also Tim Williams, who came to us at the beginning of the 40th Parliament as a young journalist, who's been an assistant research officer. He's handled a lot of media for us. He's prepared a lot of speeches and done a lot of research as well. And he's grown as a young man into a very, very capable research officer. What weighs very heavily, I think, on all MPs who aren't elected is their staff, the responsibility to their staff, and the fact that they're now unemployed and will have to look elsewhere for employment. And that does weigh heavily on me. But the quality of those people, I don't think they'd last too long before someone might pick them up. I'd also like to thank some of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers executive, in particular Ray Hull and Mark McCall, who have been there from the very beginning, still on the executive. Ray was a chairman for a period of time. Mark McCall has been our treasurer for the entire time that the party has existed. Stuart Ossel, our current chairman. Steph Colaguri, Clinton Thomas, Ron Lean, Trevor Rillwalt, Fiona White-Hardig and Joe Garrick, who are all dedicated people on our state executive. I'd also like to thank all members and the clerks for their fellowship over the years. I have really appreciated that across the divide. I wish all members re-elected and those newly elected all strength in continuing to keep the other place to account and reviewing and improving legislation as this House has a duty to do. And Madam President, lastly, I wish all those members who did not contest the election or who were unsuccessful at the election all the very best for the future.
Yeah.
Thank you, the Honourable Rick Mazza, and we certainly wish you the best for the very exciting next chapter before you.